Hi there. Thanks for watching my video all the way through. My goal is to get 1,000 subscribers to my YouTube channel. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. Let's move on to the stories. Abandoned psychiatric hospital first story. Claire and Michael stood before the gloomy facade of the old psychiatric hospital known as Ellington Asylum, located on the outskirts of a small New England town. The hospital had long attracted the attention of thrill seekers. Claire and Michael were exactly that, craving adrenaline and new experiences. "Ready?" Michael asked, raising his flashlight. "Ready," Claire replied, trying to hide a slight tremor in her voice. They entered the hospital through a broken window on the first floor. Inside, it was dark and cold, the air thick with must and mold. They headed deeper into the corridors, their flashlights revealing peeling walls and old, dusty furniture. "It's really creepy here," Claire remarked, examining one of the rooms. "That's why we're here," Michael replied with a grin. They continued exploring, finding increasingly strange and frightening things. In one room, they discovered old patient records describing horrific experiments and cruel treatment methods. In another, the walls were covered with strange symbols and inscriptions. "It looks like terrible things really happened here," Michael said, holding one of the records. Walking past another long corridor, Claire suddenly stopped. She thought she heard a whisper. "Did you hear that?" she asked, looking at Michael with concern. "No, what exactly?" he replied, puzzled. Claire shrugged, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. But the whisper grew louder, as if someone invisible was following them. "We need to keep moving," Michael said resolutely. "We haven't been to the basement yet." They descended a creaky staircase into the basement. It was even darker and colder here than on the upper floors. Their flashlights illuminated grim, musty rooms filled with old medical equipment. In one room, they found a door locked with an old, rusty padlock. Using a metal rod they found in the corridor, Michael managed to open it. Behind the door was a small room with an electroshock therapy chair in the center. "Horrible," Claire whispered, approaching the chair. "Can you imagine how many people suffered here?" Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The flashlights flickered and then went out. Claire and Michael were plunged into complete darkness. Claire felt cold fingers touch her shoulder. She screamed and jumped back. "It's me," Michael's voice came from the darkness. "I got scared too. What's happening?" In response, there was only a whisper, now louder and clearer. The voices merged into a terrifying chorus, speaking in an incomprehensible language. Suddenly, the light returned. The electroshock therapy chair was empty, but Claire noticed a strange shadow around it, as if someone invisible was sitting in the chair. "We need to get out of here," Claire screamed, grabbing Michael's hand. They rushed to the door, but it was locked. Michael tried to break it down, but to no avail. Meanwhile, the whisper grew louder, filling the space around them. It seemed like the walls were closing in, and the shadows were becoming more tangible. Claire noticed one corner of the room getting darker. A figure in a white coat emerged from the darkness, with a distorted, deathly pale face. It looked straight at them, madness gleaming in its eyes. "Help us," Claire screamed, addressing the figure. But instead of helping, the figure began to approach, reaching out to them. The voices grew louder, turning into hysterical laughter. Claire and Michael backed away until they hit the cold wall. Suddenly, the light went out again, and in complete darkness, they heard only their own screams and the approaching footsteps of the figure. The light returned, but now they were no longer in the basement. Claire and Michael stood in a brightly lit operating room, surrounded by doctors in old, blood-stained gowns. They couldn't move, as if paralyzed. "What's happening?" Claire whispered, feeling her body becoming unresponsive. One of the doctors approached her with a large scalpel. His face was grim and lifeless. "We're just treating you," he whispered, his voice blending with all the whispers they had heard before. Claire and Michael screamed as the light went out again, plunging them into eternal darkness. When the locals found them, the hospital was once again abandoned and silent. Claire and Michael sat in a corner of the basement, their faces twisted in horror, their eyes empty and lifeless. They no longer spoke or moved. Their bodies were intact, but their minds were forever trapped in the nightmare of Ellington Asylum. Abandoned psychiatric hospital second story. Emily and John stood before the massive, moss-covered gates of the old psychiatric hospital. St. James' legends of strange and terrible events that happened there were passed down through generations. The young couple decided to test the truth of these stories. "Are you sure we should go in?" Emily asked, her voice trembling with anxiety. "Of course," John replied, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "We'll just take a look and leave." They walked through the gates, which closed behind them with a dull creak, absorbing light and sound. Inside, it was quiet and empty, only the wind howling through the empty corridors, creating eerie sounds. The corridors were filled with broken furniture and medical equipment. In one of the rooms, they found an old medical record dated 1956. "Look," Emily said, studying the document. "It mentions a patient named George Hartman. He disappeared without a trace." "Probably escaped," John suggested, but there was no confidence in his voice. They continued exploring until they came across a strange door at the end of one of the corridors. The door was locked, but John noticed a key lying on the floor nearby. Unlocking the door, they found themselves in a narrow, dimly lit tunnel. The air was heavy and damp, and the walls were covered with strange symbols painted in blood. "What is this place?" Emily whispered, feeling fear grip her body. "Looks like some secret part of the hospital," John replied, trying to stay calm. Suddenly, they heard footsteps behind them. Turning around, they saw a figure in a white coat approaching them. The figure's face was hidden in shadow, but its eyes glowed with a sinister fire. Emily and John ran down the tunnel, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The figure followed them, getting closer. They burst into a large room filled with old medical equipment and notes. "We have to find a way out," Emily shouted, looking around. Suddenly, the light flickered, and they heard a terrifying whisper in the darkness. It seemed like the voices were coming from all directions, surrounding them. John tried to turn on his flashlight, but it didn't work. When the light returned, they saw the room had changed. The walls were covered in bloody inscriptions, and the floor was littered with old, blood-stained medical tools. "This can't be real," Emily whispered, feeling panic rising. "We have to get out of here," John said firmly, taking her hand. They headed for another door, but it was locked. Suddenly, the room filled with eerie laughter, and the figure in the white coat reappeared, standing in the corner. Its face was now visible deformed, with empty eye sockets and a maniacal grin. "Welcome to my hell," the figure whispered, its voice low and sinister. Emily screamed as the light went out again. They heard footsteps approaching and felt cold hands touching their bodies. In the darkness, John suddenly felt Emily vanish from his grip. He desperately called her name, but all he heard were her screams and the figure's laughter. When the light returned, John found himself alone in an empty room. Emily had vanished without a trace, and the door was now open. He ran into the corridor, trying to find her, but all he found were bloodstains and scraps of her clothing. "Emily," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty halls. He found himself in an operating room where the table was covered in fresh blood. On the wall in front of him, words appeared written in blood, "She is mine forever." John felt his sanity slipping away. He knew he had to find a way out, or he would never leave this place. But the figure in the white coat pursued him at every step, its sinister laughter ringing in his ears. Eventually, he found an exit to the roof. There, under the moonlight, he saw Emily standing at the edge. "Emily, no," he screamed, running towards her. She turned, and John saw that her face was as deformed as the figure's. She smiled at him and took a step forward. When he reached the edge, Emily was gone. He stood alone on the roof, feeling the cold wind. Below, there was no body, no trace. It seemed like she had vanished into thin air. John fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. He knew he would never forget this place and what had happened here. The psychiatric hospital saint, James, would forever remain in his memory as the place where he lost his love and perhaps his soul. When he was found the next day, he couldn't speak. His eyes were empty, and his face was twisted in horror. He remained forever a prisoner of his memories of what had happened in St. James. Psychiatric Hospital, Ravenswood, third story. Doctor. Alice Harper was an experienced psychiatrist who had been working at Ravenswood Hospital for over 10 years. This psychiatric hospital, located in the heart of an old town, always had a reputation for being mysterious and frightening. Alice had never paid attention to rumors, considering them mere superstitions. However, everything changed when a new patient arrived, Liam O'Ahonor. Liam was a young man found in a dilapidated house on the outskirts of town. He claimed that something sinister was hunting him, and that only in Ravenswood could he find safety. Alice decided to take on his case, believing it to be just another instance of schizophrenia. On the first night Liam was placed in a separate room, strange events began happening in the hospital. The staff reported eerie sounds coming from his room and shadows flickering in the corridors. Alice decided to stay overnight in the hospital to find out what was going on. Checking the wards late at night, she heard quiet whispers coming from Liam's room. Approaching closer, she saw him sitting on the bed, talking to someone invisible. "Liam, who are you talking to?" she asked as she entered the room. Liam looked up, his eyes full of terror. "They have come for me, Doctor Harper," he whispered. "They never leave." Alice tried to calm him down, but he kept repeating the same thing, his voice growing more panicked. She decided to increase the dose of sedatives to help him sleep. But even under the influence of the drugs, Liam kept mumbling in his sleep, his face twisted with fear. The next day, Alice thoroughly researched Liam's history. She discovered that his family had ties to occult practices and that strange rituals were often conducted in their ancestral home. This made her wonder if his condition was linked to something more sinister than a mere mental disorder. That night, Alice stayed in the hospital again. She decided to conduct a hypnosis session with Liam to try and uncover the source of his fears. During the session, Liam began speaking in an ancient language that Alice did not recognize. His voice changed, becoming rough and sinister. "They are here, Dr. Harper," he said. "They want you." At that moment, the light in the room began to flicker, and Alice felt a cold chill that pierced her to the bone. She ended the session and hurried to leave, but Liam grabbed her hand with unexpected strength. "Don't leave me," he begged, his eyes filled with terror. Alice broke free and ran out of the room. She felt her heart pounding wildly. In the corridor, she bumped into Nurse Anna, who looked frightened. "Dr. Harper, something is happening in Liam's room." "We heard screams," she said. Alice nodded and returned to Liam's room. When they entered, Liam was lying on the floor, his body covered with strange marks, as if cut by a knife. He was unconscious but breathing. Alice called for help, and he was immediately transferred to the ICU. Trying to understand what was happening, Alice turned to her old friend, Professor Thomas Ridley, a specialist in occult sciences. The professor agreed to come and conduct an examination. Thomas brought with him ancient books and amulets. He explained that the marks on Liam's body might be symbols used in black magic to summon demons. "This place is soaked in evil," Thomas said, examining the hospital. Liam was merely a conduit for something much darker. That night, Alice and Thomas decided to perform a cleansing ritual to expel the evil from the hospital. They gathered in the basement, where, according to Thomas, the negative energy was concentrated. They lit candles and began reciting spells from ancient books. At first, nothing happened, but then the air filled with a heavy smell of sulfur. The temperature dropped sharply, and the shadows on the walls began to move on their own. Alice felt invisible hands squeezing her throat. She was suffocating while Thomas continued reciting the spells. Suddenly, there was a deafening crash, and everything stopped. The shadows disappeared and the air became clear again. Alice collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Liam woke up in his ward, the marks on his body gone. He looked healed, but his eyes were filled with sorrow. "Thank you, Doctor "Harper," he said quietly. "But they are still here. They will always be here." Alice and Thomas knew they hadn't fully expelled the evil, but they had done everything possible to reduce its influence. Ravenswood Hospital continued to operate, but its reputation became even more sinister. Alice stayed on at Ravenswood, but now she knew that something dark and dangerous lurked in this place. She continued helping patients, but every night she heard whispers and saw shadows reminding her that the evil never truly leaves Ravenswood.